Okay, thank you for coming to this webinar organised under the umbrella of the Constitution Hub at Oxford University. My name's Stuart White, based at the University of Oxford, and I'll be chairing the webinar today. This webinar is going to focus on Professor Helene Landemore's terrific 2020 book, Open Democracy, Reinventing Popular Rule for the 21st Century. Helene Landemore is in the Political Science Department at Yale University and is currently visiting at Oxford. As well as the author of Open Democracy, Helene is the author of the 2013 book, Democratic Reason, and of numerous articles in democratic theory. We also have two other fantastic speakers today, Udit Bhatia and Tom Ginsberg. Udit Bhatia is currently lecturer in the Department of Philosophy at Sheffield University, though he'll be moving to the Politics Department at the University of York in the coming academic year. Udit's research focuses on the legal and normative status of political parties and critically considers the notion of epistocracy, the notion that competent persons should enjoy exclusive or disproportionate political power. He's the author of a number of journal articles on these topics, the editor of the 2017 book, The Indian Constituent Assembly, and he's currently working on a book manuscript on political parties and democratic constitutions. Tom Ginsberg is in the law department at the University of Chicago. He's the co-author with Aziz Z. Hook of the 2019 book, How to Save a Constitutional Democracy. He currently co-directs the Comparative Constitutions Project, funded by the National Science Foundation in the US, to gather and analyze the constitutions of all independent nation states since 1789. In a moment, I'll ask Helene to begin the discussion by taking about 20 minutes to outline the argument of open democracy. I will then ask Udit and Tom each to take about 10 to 15 minutes to respond to the argument. Helene will then have up to 10 minutes to give an initial reply to these responses. We should then have about 30 minutes or so for question and answer, finishing at 7:30 p.m. Under the webinar settings of this event, the chat function is off, but you can enter questions through the Q&A function, and those questions can be seen by myself and the panelists. In the Q&A period, I'll try to choose questions to give to Helene, Udit and Tom, and I strongly encourage you to send your questions in. And the event is being recorded with the exception of the Q&A part. Finally, a brief word on the motivation for this seminar. Many of us think that democracy is of great value. This is why I, for one, and for example, strongly feel a need to support people in Ukraine against the aggression of the Russian government. But how well are real-world democracies functioning today? There's widespread concern about democratic backsliding, and the Constitution Hub at Oxford has a podcast that has been exploring this issue in recent months. In the UK, many reformers argue that the problem is that the UK isn't sufficiently like other electoral representative democracies, that it doesn't have proportional representation for elections or a codified and entrenched constitution. However, some argue that we should explore new forms of representation, such as citizens' assemblies, whether this be in the UK, in other nations, or at transnational and global levels. The problem, it is at least implied, is not only in the design of specific electoral representative democracies, but the model of representation centered wholly or primarily on elections. Is this right? Do we need to rethink, in this basic sense, the way we do democracy? Should this rethinking inform contemporary projects of constitutional design? Well, there I've introduced, I think, the thesis of the book Open Democracy. So I will now hand over to Helene to outline her book's argument.
Thank you, Professor White, for the introduction, and thank you to the University of Oxford for organizing this roundtable on my book. And of course, thank you to the discussant, my friends, Professor Ginsberg and Professor Bhatia. I'm actually visiting, indeed, the Faculty of Philosophy at Oxford, as Professor White mentioned, so I'm speaking from here. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I would like to say first a few words about the circumstances that we are in as well, because I think it's sort of shaped also or changed my own perception of the book's value or contribution. And I'll say this, I think I had a brief moment of hope during the pandemic or just after the pandemic, when I thought, well, you know, I've been writing about really utopian radical ideas for a while, and all of a sudden in this new world, maybe they're not so radical or utopian, and maybe we're on the verge of doing things differently at last, you know, like we're going to finally take seriously ordinary citizens, and because we see the need to give them voice and to center our institutions around them a lot more, right, in a context like a pandemic. But I have to say, at this point in time, I think my hopes have been squashed a little. I think the war in Ukraine in particular brings us back to something like 20th century, you know, politics, and it's a context where it feels like saving democracy seems to be a priority over deepening it. Maybe there's a way to not see it that way, and I would like to be able to make the claim that saving it means deepening it. In fact, sometimes I think that way, and I think that, well, actually, if we don't want to throw people in the arms of authoritarian and populists, we need to deepen it. And so, yes, open democracy is more relevant than ever. But at the same time, I do have to say, when you see that we're talking again about, you know, genocide and you know, things like that, it's just hard to care about citizens' assemblies. So I'm in a moment of sort of despair. So I hope that my interlocutors and my discussants can help me regain faith in some of those ideas. So motivation for the book, I thought I'd say a few words about that, because this is a sort of project that was born from a series of, you know, it's been a long process. So I wrote a book in, you know, years ago now about collective intelligence and the instrumental value, the epistemic value, specifically the knowledge aggregating value of democracy. And it made me realize that current systems do not tap the full collective wisdom of its people anywhere in the world. And that yet, theoretically at least, we have reasons to believe that we will be better served by a lottocratic selection of legislators. So, you know, legislatures by lot, as the late Erling Olling Wright and John Gastill have labeled them. But even then, which was, you know, writing that book led me to this rather radical conclusion, I had still a rather closed understanding of the way a representative democracy should work, meaning that, well, you delegate the decision process and the deliberations to a select group, preferably chosen by lot, but that's kind of it. And you may have moments of mass referenda, but you don't necessarily need to have a lot of input or interactions between these moments. And then the other motivation for my ideas, so beyond the theoretical, was the empirical. And it's the experience of a crowdsourced process in Finland that I helped co-design in the years 2012, 2013, that taught me that, in fact, the direct contribution of self-selected people can be amazingly smart, informed, useful, and contribute to the work of legislators, whether they're elected or randomly selected or otherwise appointed. And then another empirical concrete process opened my mind actually to more ideas. That was the Icelandic constitutional process of 2010. That process famously had both a random component, a national forum of 950 randomly selected citizens who set the agenda for the Constitutional Assembly, a Constitutional Assembly of 25 elected citizens who wrote the proposal, and then a crowdsourced component whereby the drafters opened up the process to the whole public and got feedback and integrated ideas into the final version of the document. So that, to me, falsified a doxa had taken for granted for a long time, namely that you need to close off the constitutional process to the crowds, the people, because popular pressure, popular emotions endanger the sort of formation of a good constitutional text. Seems to me that Icelandic experiment proved that it doesn't have to be that way, and that we can afford to be a lot more open and inclusive in the way we write the fundamental social contract. And beyond that, it's also convinced me that it's probably the case that we can do the same thing for ordinary law as well. If there is indeed a real distinction between constitutional law and ordinary law, which I'm not convinced of, but that's a separate point. So I came to the view that there surely is a way to envision democracy on completely different premises of openness, radical inclusion, radical equality, and that these sort of experimental processes that sometimes fail, as in the Icelandic case, but for a reason that I don't think have to do necessarily with the badness of the ideas, if you will, that these things could be systematized into a new paradigm. And so that's what the book is about, really. It's about a new paradigm of democracy, which is meant to be open as opposed to closed, and centered on ordinary citizens rather than professional elected elites. And more specifically, it's about a paradigm of democracy where we consider that democracy is about actual exercise of power by ordinary citizens, as opposed to consent to power, which is then exercised by a subset of the polity that is part of the polity, but ultimately a separate class, of professional politicians. So I think that leads me to the main contributions of the book. I'd say there are maybe 4, maybe 5. So the first one is this very idea of an open democracy. Centering deliberation among ordinary citizens rather than the sort of negotiations and compromises between elected officials, reconnecting us with the thought that democracy is about people's exercise of power, not just consent to power. So basically recovering the radicalness of the idea of people's power. Note that it's also, I think, a contribution to the distinction between liberalism and democracy that has been sharpened, I would say, over the last 10, 20 years, not just by me, but more importantly by people like Josh Ober, for example, because so that's a distinction between the two, right? I focus on the dimension of people's power rather than consent to power, or even certain individual rights or property rights or free speech or the conditions for a sort of free liberal society that need not be democratic otherwise. That said, it's a contribution to a concept of democracy that is still representative. That's one of the difficulty, I think, of the book. It's to make the case that, yes, I want people's power, but I don't want direct democracy. I want representation. I want people to represent and be represented in turn. So that's by contrast with the existing paradigm of democracy as consenting to being represented all the time, but also by contrast with the idea of we all rule together at all times. So I would say that involves a second contribution, which is perhaps more minor, but I spent some time in one of the chapters, trying to establish it, which is the argument that representation is not a solution to a modern problem of size, and that in fact representation, the act of standing for or others or making present others, is as old as ancient Greece at the very least, most likely more ancient still. So I go against, again, another type of doxa in political theory, which is, representation is this modern invention that you can trace to the, medieval times, but even more so to the debates, in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and that, this is an improvement over the direct democracy of the Greeks. In fact, classical Athens wasn't a direct form of democracy, even as the polity was indeed really small. But when you have 10,000 of people, you cannot all rule together all the time. It's just not feasible. So you also have to have schemes of division of labor and, in fact, representation. So much of the show was actually run by the Council of 500, popular juries, later the Nomothetai, these randomly selected bodies in charge of making laws. And yes, you had moments of seeming direct democracy in the open assemblies, but even in those assemblies, you didn't have the entirety of the people. And ultimately, those assemblies proved problematically vulnerable to capture by oligarchs. So the role was actually somewhat minimized over time. So it was a representative democracy, just not of an electoral type. And I think that if we accept that reading of history, we basically recuperate the conceptual space to talk about different forms of representation, non-electoral representation. So that's the third contribution. It's the reconceptualization of what democratic representation can be. And for me, it need not be electoral. So I sever the connection between elections and democratic representations entirely to offer instead a space for a plurality of forms of democratic representation. And for me, a representation is democratic when the position of a representative is open to all and the chances of access are equal. So to some degree, that means electoral representation is not democratic, incidentally. It's partly democratic, maybe, but it's not fully democratic. By contrast, I consider that the versions of the alternative versions of democratic representation I consider are a lot more democratic. Some of them even, I would say, almost fully. So the first one is lottocratic representation. It's when we distribute the function of a representative on the basis of one person, one lottery ticket, so to speak, because then as long as everybody is included in the lottery pool, it's strict equality, if you want. There are other forms of democratic representation that I consider, including self-selected representation, which is the kind of representation that takes place when people self-select into the role of advocating for other people. So that could be when they demonstrate, when they simply speak up in various forums, when they self-appoint as the spokesperson for a generation or a community. Finally, there's liquid representation, as I call it, which is when people are able to delegate their vote on issues to anyone they want. So it's somewhat similar to electoral representation, you might think, because it shares a sort of the dimension of choice. You actually can choose who to delegate your vote to. But the big difference, if you want, and why it's so much more democratic in my book, is that you're not restricted to a slate of party candidates. And you're not choosing people, you're actually voting on issues. And so you're delegating your vote to someone to vote for you on an issue. So to me, it's quite a different animal, if you will. Although I do acknowledge that especially the liquid representation has some problems that make it perhaps a difficult tool to use in the toolbox as a whole. So I tend to prefer and therefore center my model on lottocratic representation combined with forms of self-selected representation. And I haven't quite figured out a clear role for liquid representation. But at least I offer those categories. And I think there's a lot of experimentation that can build on that. The fourth contribution of the book, I'd say, is the list of institutional principles that define an open democracy, according to me. I offer them as ways to guide institutional reform, perhaps even constitutional reforms going forward. They are relatively abstract, but not so abstract, not as to provide that kind of a guidance, I think. So I chose 5 of them. I thought long and hard about how many I really needed, and I tried to be as parsimonious as possible. And I came up with those 5. I'm sure it's, this can be criticized, and perhaps I'm forgetting something very important, but these are the 5 that I think are at least essential building blocks. First ones, and there's a sort of a logical priority to this one, are participatory rights. The second one is deliberation. The third one is majority rule. The fourth one is democratic representation, of which I already talked. And finally, the 5th one is transparency. So I think that those 5 principles, if they are implemented in conjunction, give you something that should be quite close to, an open democracy. So maybe I'll say a word about each of them very briefly, if time permits. So participation rights are basically not just voting rights or right of free speech or these rights that already exist in our liberal regimes, right? And that do not, in fact, sufficiently add up to actual exercise of power. So they're a lot more about the ability to initiate a law, a referendum, a referral on an existing law. So it's basically trying to put the power of agenda setting in the hands of ordinary citizens. So of course, voting rights are a part of it, but I think not that just as a reactive or secondary sort of a right, but as a right of initiative. Deliberation is central next because I subscribed to this theory of legitimacy, of political legitimacy, according to which laws and policies are only fully legitimate when they are the product of an exchange of, arguments and rational justifications amongst free and equals. That's the paradigm established by Jürgen Habermas, among others. And I think it is very powerful for all kinds of intrinsic reasons, but also for epistemic ones. Because again, to go back to my earlier work, I am convinced that you will not get good laws, adequate laws, wise laws, unless they are the product of an exchange of justification and reasons among free and equals. The principle of majority rule is just the idea, expresses the idea that since deliberation will not always result in a consensus, then at some point we'll have to use a decision rule that is as fair and equal and inclusive as possible. And it seems to me that that's the only one by default that you can settle on. Democratic representation I already talked about. And finally, transparency, it's somewhat it's a principle that is of a somewhat inferior status. Perhaps I see it more as an accountability mechanism, in the sense that even if we have autocratic representatives, it doesn't mean that they can do things in secrecy and away from the public gaze. On the contrary, we should have all kinds of mechanisms to ensure accountability, and transparency is one of them. Finally, last contribution of the book, I think, is the method. In some ways, I perhaps more than some political theorists, I build on the observation, the direct observation in some cases of empirical participatory processes. And I think that's actually a fruitful method that really stretches the imagination and anchors it and nurtures it. So that's why the Icelandic example, which forms an entire chapter in the book, and the French Convention for Climate case studies, which is more of a shadow case in the book, but still as a place, are both very important and actually essential, in fact, to the argument of the book. They're not purely ornamental in that sense. In particular, I'd say that the Icelandic case has convinced me that democracy does not need to be closed, but the French case really convinced me that citizens do not have to just be there to set the agenda, which is what I believed prior to that process. They actually can serve as legislators, lawmakers. It's not something that I think theory alone could lead you to as a conclusion. I think I feel like you have to see how the dynamics of groups in those large-scale assemblies work to actually trust that the combination of emotions and epistemic and cognitive processes can equip a collective like that to actually produce laws, or at least quasi-laws. In the French case, they were put in the positions of quasi-legislators by this rash, bold and to some extent crazy decision of the president to really entrust them with that, mandate. He basically faced yellow vests who pushed against his carbon tax. So he said to the 150 randomly selected citizens of the Citizens Convention for Climate, well, you do it. Why don't you try to produce, quasi-laws and prove me wrong and prove that you can do better than a carbon tax. And the beauty of it is that among the 149 proposals that they came up with, none of them including a carbon tax. So I'll stop here. I'll just say that, I expressed some skepticism now about the potential of an open democracy, in part because of the context. I think there are still, it's not just the context, there are still some serious conceptual, philosophical difficulties with the paradigm I put forward here, including in terms of legitimacy. How can we, give randomly selected assemblies the power to make laws when they are not elected, they are not accountable in the usual, electoral ways. And I try to deal with some of these objections at various points in the book. But I think there's still a lot more work to be done to sort of seal that argument. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helene. I think we'll go straight to Udit for a response. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Stuart. And thanks, Helene, for the book and for the chance to comment on it and also your comments today. So I just want to start by saying how much I've enjoyed reading the book. And like Helene's previous book, I think this one really pushes the boundaries of how we think about democracy. And it starts by facing up to the crisis of representative democracy, by reminding us that there is indeed a challenge to be faced and that there's no quick fix available. So we can't put our hands up and say, like the realists do, that we just have to live with what we have. But nor can we take a naive approach, which says we need to just tweak representative democracy as we know it, and that'll help us fix things. So open democracy is really about an alternative approach to democracy, and it's an approach that combines ancient and modern models, that combines representative and deliberative approaches to democracy. And then there are also ways in which open democracy builds on Helene's previous work. So rather than focus purely on democracy's epistemic dimension, she now shows us that her preferred approach to democracy can be defended through various other principles and kind of principles that she's just outlined in her introductory comments. Methodologically as well, the work is much more embedded in comparative examples, draws lessons from actual political processes rather than idealized models of democracy. And on the institutional side, beyond sortation, Helene now introduces us to self-selection and offers a cautious nod towards liquid representation as a way of advancing open democracy. Like I said, there's a lot in the book to agree with and to think carefully about, but today I'm going to limit myself to a clarificatory question, and that has to do with the role of tacit authorization in the book, and then to a more substantive question about the role of self-selected representation in open democracy. So, like Helene, I'm quite sympathetic to elements of sortation. Like her, I'm also cautious about liquid representation. It's definitely an intriguing idea, and that comes out in the book that she's interested, but she's also a bit cautious given the lack of evidence on how it might work. But it's really on self-selected representation where I have a few concerns that I'm going to discuss today. But first, let's start with her position on tacit authorization. Now, who counts as a democratically legitimate representative? Helene tells us, and I'm quoting here, that democratically legitimate representatives are representatives who have at minimum been authorized by at least a majority of the people they claim to represent, end quote. And she notes that this is a minimum condition for democratic legitimacy of randomly selected as well as self-selected representatives. So this doesn't mean that representatives themselves have to be authorized by a majority. She's argued that the selection mechanism through which they're selected, whether it's sortition or whether it's self-selection, has to be authorized by a majoritarian vote. And later in the book, Helene argues that tacit majoritarian authorization may be able to confer legitimacy on self-selected groups. So as long as self-selecting groups are open to everyone, participants could claim the tacit approval of people who don't engage or participate in such spaces. And that makes me wonder, why do self-selected representatives require this additional level of authorization? Because if, as Helene argues, self-selected assemblies can acquire legitimacy from majoritarian authorization, if a majority vote approving the use of such assemblies is enough, then why do we also want to think that tacit approval confers legitimacy on such assemblies? And I ask this question because some of my worries around tacit approval, tacit authorization, and I'll come to that next, because now I want to raise a deeper question about the reliance on self-selected representatives. So Helene argues that they offer a useful alternative to electoral representation, but it's worth looking at why she wants us to look beyond elections in the first place. So like her previous work, Open Democracy gives us at least two reasons for being critical of the way elections work. Firstly, it draws on Bernard Manner's argument to remind us how elections operate on a principle of distinction. Right? They rely on human choice, which is discriminatory, biased towards traits like charisma, eloquence, although perhaps not in Britain, but theoretically at least it's biased towards traits like charisma or eloquence or height. But even under ideal circumstances, Helene says, elections typically shut lots of people out of power, people who are too ordinary to stand out in the eyes of their fellow citizens. So let's call this the distinction problem for elections. Secondly, she says that an important difference between self-selected and elected representatives lies in the way elected representatives are controlled by gatekeepers like parties. The parties get to control who runs, whereas self-selected representatives can access office if they're self-motivated. Let's call this the gatekeeping problem. I'm just going to say a little bit about the distinction problem and the gatekeeping problem, but let's start with the distinction problem. And here's my worry. First, I think the distinction problem is less inherent or intractable than Helene suggests. And second, if we do want to work with non-ideal theory, if we do think that the distinction problem is just something we have to work with, then we might need to apply a similar approach to self-selected representation. So why is the distinction problem less intractable than Helene thinks? Well, we can think of many ways in which the electoral process could be reformed in order to prevent standard socioeconomic advantages from translating into electoral advantage. So blocking the influence of money in politics, for instance. Or secondly, we can think of even more radical moves, like setting a limit on places in parliament that could be held by the rich or the educated. And finally, we could think of a possible democratic world where there's a major shift in the way we approach elections, where we don't approach elections as a way of screening the elite or the best, but where we go to the ballot box thinking, who's the most like me? Where I'm not thinking who's the most articulate or charismatic or who's the best orator. Instead, I'm thinking who's socially awkward just like me, which candidate tends to mumble on a bit just like me, where we approach elections as a way of picking the most ordinary among us as our representatives. And it's worth noting that the principle of distinction is in a sense historically contingent. It's a historically contingent way in which we approach the election process. So Helene's already noted in the book how there was a losing side in this debate, a debate which saw the point of representation as mirroring the nation, as true descriptive representation of society. So I'm thinking really of a democratic society where we internalize this mirror approach and we use it to make electoral choices. And that's why I think there's nothing inherent per se in elections that must lead to distinction-based exclusions. Right, so this might seem theoretically interesting, but realistically implausible. So Helene might argue that elections based on the principle of mirroring are just not going to happen. People aren't just going to internalize this parliament as a mirror approach. It's unrealistic. But if we're working with within these more narrow bounds of plausibility, then we should really apply the same approach to self-selected assemblies. And that's where I think the book's defense of open democracy needs more attention, because there are good grounds to worry that self-selecting assemblies will also be dominated by the charismatic, the articulate, and the elites that Elaine is worried about. And we're told that self-selection won't be so much of a problem in societies with, and I'm quoting here, equal social capital, education, and self-confidence. But then these aren't the kind of societies that most democratic states have. Now, to be fair to Elaine, she's very careful to note that there are very limited conditions under which self-selected representation is likely to work, be considered legitimate. And she argues that these conditions are most likely to be found at the local level in tightly knit communities. But that's also a conclusion I want to push back on just a bit. So when I was thinking about this, I thought of my neighbor, let's call him Steve. And Steve is a bit of a busybody. He's also incredibly sweet and helps everyone around him. And I love having him as a neighbor, but I would not want him as my representative. Now, if he were to put himself forward as our local candidate, the chances are he's going to lose. I'm not going to vote for him. But if he went off to some local committee and appointed himself as our representative, as I'm sure he will, I think we'll just have to live with that. He's popular. No one wants to call him out. If he appoints himself, that's just that. And the point is that elections and their blunt, their impersonal nature allows us to block misrepresentation in a way that self-selection might not, especially in tightly knit communities where Elaine says self-selection could possibly work best. So that's my concern with the principle of distinction. I'll just end very briefly by discussing the other argument Elaine has on why we need to get rid of elections, and that's and for preferring self-selected representation, and that's the party problem. That argument has to do with the role of gatekeepers like political parties. And Elaine says that elected assemblies typically have gatekeepers that shut most people out of power. And I think, again, it's worth pushing back against this view a bit. I know that Elaine also has a problem with parties on other grounds. They distort deliberation, make discussion harder. But as far as the gatekeeping role of parties is concerned, that's something that's received quite a bit of attention lately, of course. And there's two things I want to end by saying. Well, firstly, pro-party people might say, well, parties have all sorts of problems, but they're really open to everyone in principle. Only some people come and vote within parties and participate in intra-party processes. But that's the kind of self-selection that you're fairly sympathetic to in the book. So while parties might be gatekeepers, they're self-selecting spaces of representation. And secondly, and I think this is a more important point, there's been a lot of work recently on how parties need to be democratized, how they need to have internal democracy and spaces for deliberation. And much of this work is trying to precisely to curtail parties' role as gatekeepers. And the idea is to reinstate the linkage function that the parties were historically supposed to perform and to make them genuine agents for popular sovereignty rather than barriers to it. So my question for Elaine is, if parties were to become the kind of open, inclusive, and deliberative spaces that some theorists have demanded, could we then be more sympathetic to electoral assemblies rather than self-selected ones? But I'll end there, and I'm looking forward to Elaine's comments, and Tom's, of course.
Many thanks, Sudit. Some really great questions there. So I'll hand straight over to Tom.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Elaine and Udit. Elaine, you've written a wonderful book. I feel like, of course, we've been in conversation about some of these themes, I think, probably since the Iceland proposal came out, which is probably when we met and deliberating about that case. And I really think it's marvelous. I mean, I really am really attracted to sortition in general. I think one thing you've done, and I should say just by way of introduction, I'm not a political theorist, right? So I work on constitutional design generally, on problems of democratic backsliding. And in that regard, I think you've done a wonderful thing by pointing us to the deeper problems of representative democracy than just the problems of the last decade. So when people are, sort of wringing our hands, like, what is the crisis of democracy? It must be parties, it must be economic inequality, it must be the social media. Well, you are pointing out that we're basically using an 18th century technology for 21st century problems. And so modernizing that should be priority. Now, as I will explain, I do have some quibbles and some concerns about the realistic scope of this. Just this morning I was arguing with my wife and I'm always arguing with my wife and kids about issues like prison abolition. So they're all abolitionists, and I'm, a realist, I guess I would say. And yet, you need people to be arguing for prison abolition. You need, I guess you would call this ideal theory, I suppose, that something towards which we can work towards. Now, you're one step more precise in that regard, one step more institutional. But I do think that we should adopt these mechanisms as widely as we can, but also to be realistic about their limits. So let me move forward in that regard. So first of all, Iceland's a really central case for you. And I think, you've dealt with some of the issues which I have had with the Icelandic process. Again, I think it's wonderful that they tried to do this, but it does raise concerns that in this basically ideal conditions of a rich, educated European democracy where everyone knows each other, you still really couldn't get that much public participation. As you point out, there were thousands of comments on Facebook, but as you also know, and I think you say in the book, when we really looked into them, they were just, a small number of individuals as repeated participants. So even in that crisis, great economic crisis, people couldn't sustain their attention. Another point you may remember is really more of a critique of direct democracy, but because it was involved in the Icelandic process, I think it's worth emphasizing. You may remember that they went to a constitutional referendum with 6 topics that they were going to ask the public for. And the way they framed the questions, they knew what answers they wanted, but the public basically answered yes to all of the questions, including one on whether they should retain the national church in Iceland, just because of the phrasing of the question. And I think that, the sentiments of the committee was to go against that, and probably the sentiments of the public. That is, even in a highly educated, rich European democracy, the public's attention couldn't focus enough on the phrasing of the questions to get their putative preferences right. So the objection from incompetence may be there. I agree with you that applies to normal representative democracy. I don't think it applies any more to the deliberative kind of things that you have in mind, and probably less so. But I do want to point out that it is a real constant objection, obviously going back, as a very old critique of mass democracy. Now, I have one technical kind of question, which comes from just my work in constitutional design. In constitutional design, we're constantly in situations where you're trying to get the preferences of the public. In Iceland was pretty good conditions. We just had something in the Gambia. One problem in those exercises that I'm not sure you pay enough attention to is aggregation. Like, it's technically hard to figure out what, 100,000 citizen comments would involve, and what are they really saying? What is the public saying? The Rousseauian general will out of this, very pluralistic and diffuse set of things. That aggregation is necessary to translate anything into policy. Technically, I think it's a really big challenge. Now, you do raise the French case, which was really interesting to me, and one in which I'm convinced, they probably did a pretty good job. You're pretty qualified. It seemed pretty amazing to me that they could do something like this on the scale of France, and very optimistic in terms of the critiques of scale. But, why were they able to aggregate? Because it's the French bureaucracy, for God's sake, right? That is, you have a lot of bureaucratic capacity, which was necessary to translate into some kind of workable propositions. This gets to a big point, which you do, I think, acknowledge, but I want to emphasize, which is that open democracy depends on liberal democracy. It depends on an underpinning of voice, of rights of organization and assembly, and probably also depends on a good deal of bureaucratic capacity, which Aziz Huq and I include in our definition of constitutional democracy. It's rather unconventional, but I think that is really important to make this kind of thing really work. Okay, let me raise 2 other points. One of the functions of representatives in a constitutional democracy, of course, is to make laws and to express policy preferences. And that's what your proposals address. There's another function which is completely missing here, and that has to do with the accountability function. So when you were listing your 5 kind of core features, you didn't list accountability. And by that, I mean, of course, that you are going to need some sort of executive branch. And a question for you, would you select that by sortition? If not, how are we to think about the relative relationship between the probably elected, politician and these various mechanisms, and where will accountability come in the system? Now, you might just answer, well, we're still going to have our representative, institutions, our ordinary ones, and that's fine. And then that makes some sense. But then that leads to the next question, which is, what is the scope of the proposition? When will we go to these citizens' assemblies, and when will we not? You say, well, of course, citizens are free to join or not. No one's going to be coerced into doing so. But citizen attention is, of course, very, very limited. That leads me to conclude, from after reading your book, that the optimal use of these kind of mechanisms, we have some examples of. I think the Irish Citizens' Assembly is a great case. Citizens' assemblies and similar mechanisms, sortition, all this stuff should be used as very occasional tiebreakers, that they should be brought in when we have a contentious issue on which we need to know what the public says. And that is kind of an epistemic function, though it's a little bit different than the epistemic function you're emphasizing. It's letting the political community know what the preferences are given a major contested issue. The Irish Citizens' Assembly basically, of course, was on abortion and some other issues. And, that helped resolve a major deadlock in Irish society. Really excellent use of it. But notice how that's very episodic. It's not something that we could continuously rely on or possibly serve to replace, constitutional liberal democracy. It also suggests that it might even affect our definition of democracy itself. Like when you're emphasizing epistemic quality of democracy, representing and being represented in turn, that's exciting. But there are different definitions. The one I kind of am drawn to is Jaworski, Adam Jaworski, who basically says democracy is a system of conflict resolution. We have forces in society. You did mention parties, they're in conflict. And the beauty of democracy is that it allows us to resolve the problem with a vote, move on to the next issue, instead of lingering and perhaps metastasizing into other forms of social life. I think that everything you write about, we should all adopt as mechanisms of conflict resolution for major problems of the day. The Fishkin stuff, the sortition, all of this is great. But I don't see a realistic scope where it would truly replace liberal democracy. And with that, I will conclude and pass the buck back to you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Just to our audience, just to say, if you want to get your questions in, we'll be starting the Q&A in about 10 minutes. So if you want to start queuing up the questions, feel free to enter them through the Q&A function. But thank you to Tom for another set of great questions, and we'll go back now to Elaine for some initial responses to Udit and Tom's questions.
Well, thank you both for the great comments. I actually don't know where to start, but I think I'll start with the, I'm sorry, my light keeps going off. The worry about whether elections are inherently elitist. Well, I do insist on thinking that the problem is inherent, but it's not so much the elitism as the fact that it's discriminatory in a way that will always result in unequal distribution of power. That's the main point. It could be, you're right, that in a very educated, egalitarian society, everybody votes for, I don't know, the shy nerds that are really likable. But that still means, then other people are not chosen, and you end up with another type of discrimination in some ways. And I think it's inherent in human choice. Human choice is not blind. And so I guess maybe I should have said something simpler, which is that, because it's true, like in Manin, the claim is a little bit more sociological, empirical. It's about, you end up with socioeconomic elites, because historically it's always been the case. But I think for me, it's more like ontological, almost like human choice is such, formal. Human choice is such that you will never get pure equality in the distribution of offices. So that's it. That's the problem. And I wonder whether it's not a sort of a, now that you point this sort of problem, I wonder whether it's not built in my definition of what counts as a democratic representation, that anything that deviates from that strict equality, in fact, is going to be elitist in the sense I say. But anyway, that's what I mean, and I don't want to. I cannot acknowledge that the problem will be resolved by just educating people or taking money out of politics. It will always be there. Then the problem of self-selecting assemblies, I'm very sensitive to that problem for sure, and that's why, in fact, I think that while there's a role for those assemblies, I don't think they should have a legislative role or a decisive role the way I think sortition-based assemblies could or should. And that's for all the reasons you mentioned, that they are highly unrepresentative descriptively. They can be, as we saw in the case of, classical Athens, they can be manipulated by factions. There are all kinds of problems. But at the same time, I can't deny that, when, for example, the Yellow Vests mobilized, they were highly unrepresentative sociologically of the rest of the population, right? They were highly representative of the subset of the population that was suffering the most from, that have been suffering the most from neoliberal policies of the last 30 years, that were directly going to pay the price for the carbon tax because they live in the periphery of cities. They need to, buy gas and cars and they were never going to be compensated for the additional cost. I mean, that's a reality. So it's the same thing with globalization. We were told, let's open the borders and then we'll compensate the losers. And of course, the compensation never happened. And exactly the same for the carbon tax. So I think that they have, and why am I mentioning the Yellow Vests? Because the French population as a whole, at the beginning of the movement was incredibly supportive. I think the highest was like close to 80% of support for the demonstrations and the demonstrators, because there was a sense that, yeah, it's profoundly unjust and we're behind you and you can demonstrate and block the highways and we're behind you. And of course, that support diminished over time because the movement became violent, the politics became complicated and ugly in some places. But there was a tacit authorization of a sort, and I'm not sure how much legitimacy it gives and for what kind of actions beyond just like the freedom to demonstrate and put the country on pause for a while, but I think it's something real that needs to be taken seriously. So that's why I at least considered it. As to the question of the parties, as I concede in the book, parties are, a bit of a blind spot for me. I can't really reconcile them with the concept of deliberative democracy, because I think there are places where you cultivate same-mindedness and a sort of loyalty to the group over loyalty to the truth, and that's not compatible, in my vision, or with the epistemic properties of a functioning democracy. So I could see, I'm not saying that, in the book, I acknowledge that they would probably survive in a pure open democracy, but as think tanks of sorts, right? They would no longer be vessels or tanks to capture power, right? And so that they would just be a different kind of beast. They would be associations of the like-minded. They would be, closer to think tanks or interest groups operating as influencers in campaigns leading up to mass referenda, for example, but not being the agents that end up choosing and pushing to the fore candidates. So given that we're going to stay with parties for the foreseeable future, where do I see them, and what do I make of these democratized parties that are more open and more deliberative? Well, I think that's good. I think that's good to instill the right values in the members, and there surely is a room for what we know, what Jane Mansbridge called enclave deliberation. Like people who think the same and figure out the best arguments for any given position. But I can't see. especially now that they've been abandoned by the masses, I still think they're mostly a place for rent seekers. And I just have a hard time, seeing their added value from an epistemic point of view. And I know there are, arguments out there saying they're the place where you develop rational platforms, etc. But I think right now this is not what I see. So that takes me to Tom's pushback against the realism of all of this. On Iceland, I just say this. I think it was a pilot experiment in some ways, so it's not surprising that it failed. So I'm less sort of discertain than you about the lack of public participation or the fact that people made mistakes during the referendum in the way they voted. I mean, you could also blame in part, you could look at the French case and see that the public participation was much greater. For example, in the Great National Debate, we had over 2 million submissions. You can definitely do better than the few hundred or thousand contributions than the Icelandic case had. You could also consider that in the referendum, the people who designed the questionnaires did a really poor job, right? The question that people got wrong, basically you had to answer no to express support, whereas every other question you had to say yes to express support. So it's not so shocking that they made the mistake. I think, when you can't operate your phone, you don't blame people, you blame the Apple designer, right? There's also that. But point granted, I do accept that, there will be limited participation. That's why in my model, I actually try to minimize the demands on people's times. And I'm not such a big fan of mass participation and referenda at every corner. I think they should be used wisely and preferably on the initiative of citizens themselves rather than necessarily the higher authorities. Then your point about the French case, which you read it as well, it's evidence that basically you need a bureaucracy. Well, absolutely. My open democracy doesn't, require to get rid of all experts or bureaucracies. I mean, it's just the idea is simply that you put citizens at the center and on top, and the bureaucracy is there to serve and be at the disposition of the citizens. And also, the thing is always compared to what, and compared to elected legislatures, I don't think that the French Convention for Climate relied on a bureaucracy more than elected parliaments do. In the US, the Congress is like an entire office of people in charge of helping them evaluate the impact of policies, writing briefs and drafting laws, and that's what they do. In the end, the parliamentarians themselves, what do? They show up and they sign and they vote. They don't necessarily write much of the actual law. So I think comparatively, I don't see that randomly selected citizens have more of a need for bureaucrats than elected ones. So comparatively, and again, we don't have enough data points, obviously, because this has never been done, but I think you could at least imagine a scenario where you have an institutionalized citizens' assembly that maybe for a year, maybe two, that is relying on a very, available, but also very subservient bureaucracy that doesn't legislate itself, but help the citizens legislate, and is on top and not on top, as it's a phrase I always use, but I think it really summarizes the ideal position of bureaucrats to the citizen legislators. Then your point about, and by the way, there's already examples of institutionalized citizens' assemblies in Europe. So it's not that they can only be used sporadically and rarely as tiebreakers. There's the Belgian case of this assembly that sets the agenda for the for the parliament of the German-speaking region of Belgium. I think it's been in place for 3 years now, and it works quite well. Paris just created last October a Council of Parisians, 100 randomly selected Parisians that's going to be in place for a year. We'll see if that works out and what are the conditions under which it's actually producing anything good. But I think it's already happening, whether we like it or not. And I like it. Now, your point about accountability, which is not a principle. It's true, I did mention transparency as an accountability principle, but accountability for me, it's something we want. It's not a principle. It's something we want in any system. And you asked me, what about an executive branch? So I totally agree that there's another blind spot in the book, which is, what about the executive function? What about the judiciary function, actually, for that matter? What about the bureaucracy? I don't have much to say about those things. For the executive function, I have to say that for me, the ideal would be to move away from presidential regimes and the fact that we've given so many legislative powers to the executive, when in fact, you know, the executive to me should execute. And so that should be a relatively subordinate function where we're not that interested in who's doing it as long as they're doing it well. So I'm thinking of perhaps the Swiss model, where they have a council of 7 executives whom nobody knows and nobody cares about, really. And it seems to work well over there. So why can't we have that instead of having these personalities, which, whether it's Obama or Trump, are adored and worshipped or hated in ways that are profoundly immature and counterproductive? Because, and Macron is the same. People worship him or actually more often than not hate him, because they think it's all his decision one way or another. I mean, how is that democratic, and how is that realistic, even to think that one person should hold all the cards and make all the decisions? So I don't have much to say apart from that, and I'd love to hear from you actually what you think, whether it's even possible to imagine a different system in which, you know, as I propose, the center of the whole thing is an assembly of citizen legislators, and everything revolves around that, including the executive.
Thank you very much, Helene, for very succinct and to the point response to those comments from Udit and Tom.